The plurality with elimination method is next up in our book, and it's often referred to as the Hare method, or instant runoff voting, or ranked choice voting. And the idea behind the plurality with elimination method is to, well, first of all, obviously it's going to be using plurality method, but basically also feature a component where we're eliminating candidates as well. So you might be wondering, well, why would we want to use an elimination, or where would that come into play? But basically, what we're doing is we're calculating the form of a runoff, which I think I mentioned this in a previous video. But just to recap, often if an election is too close, or if there is not a determining, if there's not a concrete determination to the outcome, we often, as a society, have a runoff. Basically, redo the election, and typically what's done is some of the candidates are removed to kind of focus in on the candidates that we're leading. Like, say, for example, we run an election with four candidates, and two of the voters each get 40% of the votes, and the other two get 10% each. Uh, Essentially, those two candidates have no chance of winning. But when the first two are kind of neck and neck or tied, we don't necessarily know who's the better choice. We could do a runoff and see, well, where do those other 20% of people lie? And that might give us more clarity um, in what we're doing. And basically, we don't actually need to do a runoff. We can actually use the preference schedule to do that, and that's the entire idea behind the plurality with elimination method. Let me go into slideshow mode because I didn't for some reason, and I meant to. Um, but basically, let's examine the steps for how to run the plurality with elimination method, and we'll do a couple examples as always. Um, First step, it says to count all the first place votes as you would using normal plurality. So basically, first place votes are what count in the elimination method. But then step two says if the leading candidate is not winning by a majority of the vote, eliminate the candidate with the fewest first place votes. And if there is a tie, but for the fewest first place votes, eliminate all of them. So essentially, if the person who is leading, say for example in that example we had 40% for one person, that's not a majority of the vote. And to define what majority means, majority always means more than half. So if someone has exactly 50% of the vote, that's technically not a majority. And so basically any number past 50% would be considered majority. So say for example we had 100 voters in our election, a 50 would not be a majority, but 51 would be a majority. So with majority, it's always exceeding the cutoff, and what we call a simple majority is always 50%, half. So more than half is simple majority. And there's other types of majority too, which is in the next slide. I'll get to that. But basically, so if the leading candidate in plurality does not have 50% of the votes, or more than 50% of the votes, they're not eligible to win under the elimination method. So basically, then we're going to eliminate whoever's in last place. Say for example, one of the people with 10% vote, and then we'd see, well, what happens and what changes. And one of the things you might be wondering is, well, nothing will change, but when someone's eliminated. But basically, what will happen is we're going to have to shift the votes from the candidate who was eliminated to the next best choice. And that's kind of what the note here says. It says, be careful, it will change the rankings. And I'll kind of show you what I mean when we actually look at the class election example once again. And then number 3 says, repeat steps 1 and 2 until a candidate wins by a majority. So basically, we're going to eliminate the weak link and then recalculate. And then see, well, who's winning at this point. If someone still does not have a majority, eliminate the next slowest candidate. And basically keep eliminating people until one candidate has a majority of the votes. And obviously, there should always eventually someone will win by a majority. Because if you keep eliminating candidates, eventually you'll be left with two. Now, technically, it could come down to exact tie, 50-50, with only two candidates remaining, and then you're stuck, and it would result in a tie. But that's pretty unlikely. Also, just to define some of the other terms from the packet, sometimes we refer to other types of majority, and this is something that's going to come back in later chapters, and so I wanted to just talk about it now, so we don't have to do it again later. But basically, and this is not really relevant to this chapter at all, But sometimes other common types of majority would be, say, a two-thirds majority, three-fifths majority, or a supermajority, which are terms that are used a lot in various election scenarios. And basically, all that means is kind of the same thing. It's just we're specifying instead of a simple majority, which is just more than half, more than 50%. A two-thirds majority would be more than two-thirds. So two-thirds translates to 66.6 repeating percent. And in the same way, the term majority always means more. So to have a two-thirds majority, you have to have more than two-thirds of the vote to qualify. And actually, technically, some people define it as needing at least two-thirds rather than more than two-thirds, but I'm just going to define it as more than two-thirds. And same with a three-fifths of majority would be more than 60% or whatever. You could have a four-fifths majority or five-sevenths or whatever, any sort of fraction that is greater than 50% as a specified type of majority. And the reason you might want to use that as a different criteria is just, again, it's usually situational. Of course, you could have a unanimous selection required, which just means 100% everybody has to say yes, which is much harder to have happen in a lot of voting situations. And in the U.S., the term supermajority often refers to a two-thirds majority, but this is sort of a blanket term that you might encounter, at some point in your life, and that just means way more than half. So it's kind of just a general, there's no necessary, quantitative measurement to way more. What does that mean? But anyways, I think you get the picture. So let's finish up this video with an example. Let's actually run the plurality with elimination method, and let's return back to the same example we've been doing. Let's try to figure out who would win the class president under plurality with elimination. So I'm going to end the slideshow here and go back to the packet to continue working on this. So okay, and all the step-by-steps for these methods are also in the packet. It's a very handy resource to, have. It's sort of like a little focused textbook with all the, um, all the methods and piece of information in one place, which is why I usually give them to my students, and it kind of helps with having all these things in class. Anyways, let's figure it out. So basically, if we're running plurality with elimination, we start with the same normal step where we're figuring out, well, only first place votes count, because that's what plurality means. And we're in the exact same spot that we were in 1.2, where Art is leading with 14 votes. And we could kind of keep track of this, so at this point in time, Art is ahead 14. Kathy's in second with 11. Debbie's in third with 8. And Ben's in last with 4 votes. But basically now, since what we would do is determine, well, who's my leading candidate? That would be Art. And see, does he have a majority of the vote? And to know if he has a majority or not, we need to know how many total voters we have, so we can check what percentage 14 is out of the total. So if we add up all the voters, 14 plus 10, 24 plus 8 is 32, 36, 37. So we have 37 total voters. And often the book will use V for that, what's the total number of votes in the situation. And if we cut that in half, that would give us a simple majority. So 37 divided by 2. And another way that people often refer to majorities is always, sometimes people say 50% plus 1. That's not entirely correct, though. You could also think about it as 50% round up. And if it's already round, you will add 1. But basically, a simple majority here would be 18.5, and we need to exceed that, so that would be 19. Now, another thing that students have asked me is, do you have to add 1 and then round up? But basically, you should only do one or the other, whichever makes sense. So in this case, it makes sense to just round it up to 19, which would be our simple majority. So summary, Art does not have a majority of the vote, so we have to, in part 2, if the candidate is not winning by a majority, eliminate the candidate with the fewest first place votes. So basically, in this case, Ben had the least number of first place votes, so he's going to be eliminated first in plurality with elimination. Um, and now what you might be wondering is, well, what does this do? How does this change it? But if we kind of are imagining the ballot, what I like to do is actually X Ben off of my ballot, because what we're sort of pretending is that he's no longer in the running for class president. Basically, we've said, okay, you're not going to win. What what has changed in our election by removing you? And notice that it doesn't actually change any of the first place votes, but what does happen is it eliminates these four voters' first choice. And to keep fairness, we don't like the thing we have to do here is we don't want to just delete their four votes. And if we kept all these numbers the same, that's what we do. But it's essentially we're going to be shifting these votes to the next highest candidate. So what I like to do is circle whoever's below Ben or whoever's below the first elimination, because basically their first place vote will shift to whoever was in their second slot. And now you might be thinking that's not really a first place vote, that's a second place vote. But if their leading candidate is no longer in contention, if you think about how they would vote if they were doing a runoff, the assumption is, well, if they're voting sincerely, they would have Debbie as their new first place, and Kathy would become their second place. So technically, what happens is all the rankings shift. Now this would be first, second, third, first, second, third, first, second, third. There is no such thing as a fourth place vote anymore. And also, if you're doing elimination with board account, it will actually change all the points. And one of the written homework questions always gets into that. But since we're purely online over summer due to COVID, uh, we don't have written homework just this semester. But anyways, so Ben's vote are going to be shift to Debbie. And basically what I like to do is add 4 to Debbie's total because she's now has uh, 12 votes. Um, because these 4 people now have Debbie as their favorite. So what you will notice is this will change the rankings, and as we're continuing to run the plurality with elimination method, who's in first place could switch as we go. So Art's not just going to necessarily win as he would have under regular plurality. So basically, but notice that even after eliminating Ben, Art still does not have a majority. So if I repeat steps 1 and 2, I recount all the first place votes. If the leading candidate is not winning by a majority, eliminate the candidate with the fewest first place votes. Basically, now we redo it. Now Ben's gone, and we say Art is still leading. Debbie's now in second, Kathy's in third. So we need to eliminate, because Art still does not have a majority, so we're going to eliminate Kathy next, because Kathy is the new last, right? Because now Ben's gone. Kathy, with 11, has the least number of first place votes after the first elimination. And so, like in the same way, I like to eliminate Kathy from my preference schedule and just X her off everywhere. And the reason it's nice to do it everywhere is that way it's easier to tell who should get the vote. And also, what I would remind you to do, or just emphasize as the important thing with this method, is after you're eliminating a candidate, make sure to assign their first place vote to whoever is next. Or in the case, like notice with these 10 voters, they had Ben second, but he's already been eliminated. So they're kind of down to the third option because their top 2 choices were eliminated, which is just, they're probably not too happy about that, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles in the case of this method. And the last 1 voter there, their vote would also shift to Debbie. So in this case, all 11 of those votes are shifting to Debbie, which leaves Debbie with 23 votes. Now, and also at this point, notice we are now done because uh, Debbie now has a majority, right? Because once we get to 23 votes, that now exceeds the halfway point, and so Debbie will win by plurality with elimination method because she now has a majority of the vote. So basically, in conclusion, Debbie's going to get first place here with 23 votes. And also, Art will be in second place because he did technically last through 2 of the eliminations. So even though he didn't get a majority, he is still going to take second under elimination. And if you want to do a complete ranking, we're going to rank them in order, reverse order of elimination. So whoever was eliminated first is going to get last place, which was Ben, because he had the lowest number of first place votes. And Kathy was eliminated second, so she's going to get third, and so on. So that'll wrap up this video. In the next video, I'll do a couple more examples. This is one of the trickier methods, and usually in my experience, students tend to get a little bit stuck on this. So if this is a little bit tricky and hard to follow, you're not alone, and I'll be around in lab and over email to try to help.